notes with the PowerPoints will be in fine shape, but give you an additional media here by having some recordings along with the PowerPoints. So this is Chapter 6, Public Opinion, the last of our 3 chapters that we'll have for Test 2. There are 2 main themes that you can see here from Chapter 6, how our opinions are formed and how our opinions are measured. So we all have opinions. Even if you don't have an opinion, it's an opinion. And how do you go about measuring that opinion? Get some sense of where the public is on a particular issue. So those are the 2 main themes that we see covered here in Chapter 6. There's conflict in politics, and we mentioned that going back to the very first chapter. And here's a way of measuring that conflict, getting that in perspective by looking at the outcomes of particular questions. So you can read about this on page 212. I hope you will look that over. Percentages saying blacks in their community are treated less fairly than whites, and you see a difference there. So whether that's a reality or not, that can be a different issue. The perception is the issue here, and how that's measured. That's opinion. And so there we can see the roots, are at least the outcome, I should say, of a conflict and how it's measured. So when we look at public opinion polls on page 233, you can see that it's scientific instruments for measuring public opinion. It's a snapshot. After all, even if some of you perhaps are interested in biology and maybe you want to study, let's just say, coyotes. Well, you wouldn't study every coyote. That would be impossible. So you would take a snapshot of coyotes. You would measure the lifespan perhaps, or diet, certain kinds of ways in which coyotes would live their life. And so you would take that sample, and that would be used then to measure the same type of behaviors of other coyotes. In many ways, the same type of practices are carried out when measuring public opinion polls of Americans or anybody else that would be part of a study. So let's think about this snapshot and some of the changes that have occurred in the last few years looking at presidential elections. Certainly several years before the 2016, well, a couple of years before the 2016 presidential election. And here you can see in that summer, this is before any of the primaries or caucuses. We'll be reading about that as we get into chapters 8, 9, and 10. But here we can see on the Republican side which candidate was the most popular. And the same thing on the Democrats, for the Democrats, the different candidates that you had, and on that snapshot in the summer of 2015. In the fall of 2015, a few months after that first survey, you can see a considerable change that occurred here among Republicans. And for Democrats, not that much of a change, although we can see that Sanders moved up in that snapshot. And so here, a few months before the presidential election, you can see there was a considerable gap there. And then that gap is narrowing as we get within a month of the election. So in 2012, the next to most recent presidential election, even though 2016 there were things wrong with those elections, as we'll point out, there was even more so in 2012 in many ways. You had one of the major polling firms, Gallup, predict that Romney, the Republican candidate, would defeat the incumbent Democrat candidate, President Obama. And here we can see that there were some explanations as to how that was wrong for Gallup. So a lot of it just having a bad sample, and you can see that through these explanations given by Gallup. So spend some time looking over those explanations. 2016, same thing. You had some ways in which the polls were wrong. Clearly, the big difference here, that it's very important to think about the Electoral College. So Hillary Clinton did get 3 million more votes than Donald Trump. The issue was 80,000 votes in 4 states, in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Wisconsin. 80,000. Those states going for Trump as a candidate in 2016. So it's interesting to think about that. 80,000 people would not even fill in the whole stadium at the University of Michigan football stadium. So you can see the narrow outcome of that election and what the Electoral College can mean. So going into that election, one of the better sources on predicting elections, you had 538, interesting source, you might want to check that out, 15% chance for Trump to win. You did see, though, based on the polling, one group outperforming, and that was a big reason why that was not captured correctly by the polls. A big issue here we can also see from really a good source called The Atlantic, a very good magazine. It's getting to a point where, and this kind of makes sense, just think about your own use of technology, that sources that use landlines are just not very effective polls. You need to go to cell phones. And we could also see here some differences. You didn't really capture the accuracy of states, those 4 states I just mentioned, for example, compared to the national polls. So again, might want to spend some time looking over why 2016 did not go well. So the last 2 elections, presidential elections, for polling, they've not been very effective, and it could be people's attitudes toward polls have changed, and it could also be the changes, clearly, the changes in technology. And that also, the Electoral College, just keep that in mind. The Electoral College is a system, we don't see this used by other countries, where a person could win the election and lose the popular vote. All right, so we had some questions, had some issues there of covering polling. Here we get this process of how we go about learning about politics. Each one of us goes through this process called political socialization. So certainly read about that, page 209. We can certainly see that, as this graph shows, our families are going to have that initial power or influence in shaping our viewpoints about politics. Most of you taking this class, really all of you taking this class, even though we have some considerable age differences among people taking this class, still you're in that process in which your friends are having more influence over you and your viewpoints about politics than your family. And that's just a part of the transition that occurs for every person. That you go through this stage, and now it's your friends that are going to have more influence. You're going to be around them more than your family, than your parents, and so they're going to have that greater influence. But through a good portion of your life, it was your family that had the greatest influence. So when we look at agents of political socialization, you look through that process, political socialization, and then there are different factors, organizations, individuals that would be called agents of socialization that would have that influence on you. So the family, through a good portion of your life, has the greatest influence on shaping your views of politics. Now, maybe that's changing in some ways as the 2-parent household is changing, but that doesn't mean that the family would necessarily decrease its influence on political socialization. It just means that the family's changing. but that may mean that this dynamic is something that needs to be studied in a different way. Perhaps grandparents have more influence, or a step-parent may have more influence. So some different ways of looking at how families have influence on politics. But you're using other sources, and so clearly the media becomes a very effective agent of socialization. What you choose as your sources of information become extremely important. Do you choose different agents of socialization, different media sources that give you perhaps a conflicting point of view, some that may challenge your basic beliefs or ideas about politics? We're increasingly less likely to do that, and so it's interesting to see how that influences our viewpoints about politics and how we choose to use the media. And clearly, we're seeing a more of an influence of electronic media as opposed to a paper media. Churches certainly have influence on really everybody. So even if you're not a churchgoer taking this class, you're going to be around people who are churchgoers, or are influenced by a particular religion. And so while you have a tax policy in America where they're not supposed to be openly leaders of churches or faiths, not supposed to be openly endorsing one candidate over another, that doesn't mean that they can't still have influence and discuss political issues. And certainly the immigration policies that are in the news right now as I'm recording this on June the 20th, 2018, then we can certainly see that some religious leaders are going to bring up their viewpoints about immigration, and that will have an influence politically among many people. Schools certainly reinforce basic ideas about our society, about our country, and so that can also then have an influence on our viewpoints about politics. And certainly your peers, so the people you hang out with. I mean, that's a big part of college, isn't it? Who are your friends here in college? And so what the friends say to you will have an influence on your viewpoints about politics. Now, does this mean that sometimes you can have friends or be around peers in which you decide to now challenge some basic ideas? A change agent. And we can see this in our culture. I mean, ways of describing other people perhaps were accepted 50 years ago, 100 years ago, that are not accepted today. And that's been because there are change agents who step forward and say, that's an inappropriate joke, or that's an inappropriate comment, that's an inappropriate description. And while we may call that politically correct, we can also see how that's important, that it changes our way of viewing another human being. And so we can see the importance there. And have you been a change agent? Do you know people who are change agents? The sociologist Margaret Mead would say that's really the only way you ever get people to change things in a society. It's a very powerful quote there. You might want to look it over. We also have political parties. Many of you are approaching this class that you're a strong supporter of one party over another. And so, you know, that's a way of looking through the world through the particular set of lenses. And that's going to have an impact on how you view politics and how you view political leaders. So when we look at religion, we can see one aspect of religion in which it's very influential in our society. So how people view the atheist. And I would assume that there are people in this class that are atheists. But overall, the approach towards atheists has been one in which other people in society view them with least amount of trust. That may be changing, but that has been the experience, at least from the polling done by the University of Minnesota. And we can also see that there are different ways of measuring a belief in religion. After all, would the one person who attends church twice a year have the same type of viewpoint towards religion as someone who attends a church twice a week? I think we can see there that there can be considerable differences in what's referred to as religiosity. So you might want to spend some time here, pause and look this over, measuring different kinds of groups and how the public viewed these particular groups. An atheist was just not supported much. So ultimately, if you're thinking of who to vote for a president, and someone who, even if they were very honest about their religious viewpoints and they said they don't have any, they're an atheist, at least the way it has been is that the public has not been supportive of that type of approach towards religion. In fact, this is the last known atheist in Congress. And we have 435 people in the House of Representatives at any given time. And Representative Stark passed away a few years ago. And no one else has come forward to say that they are an atheist. Now, statistically, there should be some atheists in Congress, but you don't have anyone that's coming forward and saying that. So we do see that there's all kinds of religious viewpoints in the United States, and that's reflected by the different kinds of symbols that you can see at the Arlington National Cemetery, which would also include the symbol for the atheist. You can go online and get these symbols, but on the second row at the left side, you'll see there the atheist symbol. Lots of different symbols for Christian groups and other religious groups of other organizations. All right, back to polling. How do we create a successful survey? And a key part of that is the sample. And so here we can look at the keys to a successful survey, and it has to do with the sample there. And so look over those different keys that are mentioned. We have different types of polling. Some of these are mentioned in your book. Others are a little bit are additions. A tracking poll, you measure trends. Maybe you do a poll of people for 7 straight days, one whole week, and see if there's a trend that changes on that daily basis. Those are very expensive and perhaps not always accurate, but if you see a consistent trend, it should tell us that the public is viewing something a certain way. Push polls, your book does talk about that. It's a form of a campaign technique. We'll go into some more detail about that. Exit polls, this is something that's done to question people about how they voted right after they voted. Maybe they're in the parking lot, for example, at a polling station and are on their way to their car, and you have a surveyor asking them specific questions. Now, it may be who they voted for, but it could also be questions of demographics, such as your age, your religion, income. People may not like to answer those questions, but this is what gives us an idea of what type of people are most likely to vote for a certain candidate. So we can see how exit polls are very important. They can be misleading if you give the results of an exit poll before the end of an election, and that may say that a certain candidate's going to win, and it may not turn out that way. After all, could some voters be less likely to answer questions by a surveyor? And what if those voters are consistently voting for one particular candidate? So that's how we can see how exit polls are not always accurate. Push poll. The push poll is put together simply to spread disinformation, so it's very misleading. It can be downright dirty, and if you read in the text, you can get some sense of how dirty a push poll has been in the past. And I think this is interesting to say, would you be willing to use a push-pull if you were a candidate? I would think some of you are considering being a candidate sometime in the future. And would you do whatever you needed to do to win an election, including using a push-pull? Think that over. This is a fantastic movie that you may want to spend some time watching. I think it's available on YouTube. It's called The Candidate. Came out in the early 1970s. Robert Redford was the main actor in the movie, and so the dilemmas that are brought out in The Candidate are still out there for a lot of people running for office. What are you willing to do to be in a process of winning an election? And that's part of what we see here in this movie. So we can see here how people's viewpoints change based on their ideology and party identification. There's a good description about ideology in this chapter as well. You can see those differences that are brought out on page 225. You can see the differences from the surveys. There clearly is an issue of income inequality in the United States. That was brought out in chapter 1 of our text, and once again reinforced to us here in chapter 6. So we can see some differences there from liberal and conservative. Look at those over on pages 206, 207. And we can see here that we have, this is a little bit dated, but some of the differences that we have here in our society based on ideology. So it's important then to once again think about that issue, political efficacy. Some of you talked about that in your very first news review, and it's a very important topic. And how will people be involved if they don't believe it will make any difference? So why do some people believe they can make a difference over others? And this is where surveys, once again, can become important. So that ability to influence the government. So be reminded of that there on page 9 in your text, and also brought out here in this chapter. All right, that's what we have there for chapter 6. So look that over, and we'll be moving on to the media, chapter 7, in our next series of recordings.